Okay, as I understand things, this is officially a Etznach Yomi program with a parak a day, and you're currently up to the end of Sefer Devrei Yamim Aleph. So I've entitled my shiur lecture class for this morning, The Last Days of David, Mikdash David and Mikdash Shelomo, as Rabbi Sutton just pointed out. And I would primarily like to focus on Devrei Yamim Aleph Parak Kafchet, 28th chapter, and we'll do a kind of in-depth analysis of what's going on in the parak. But hopefully we'll move to larger conceptions as to the last days of David, and some of the crucial issues at the end of Divrei Yamim Aleph, and perhaps also some differences between Divrei Yamim and Sefer Melachim, as we'll see as we move along. So to begin, just to refamiliarize yourselves, I'd like to ask you all to take a look at Parak Kafchet, the Divrei Yamim Aleph, and to read from Pasuk Aleph through Pasuk Kaf Aleph, the entire parak, at 21 Pasukim. And you can do that either inside in a Tanakh or on your source sheet that hopefully you all have. And I will primarily use the source sheet, I believe. It's source number 1. And I've utilized the computer for a bit of, I wouldn't say improvements, but slight tweaks of the Tanakhic text in source number 1. So take a look. It'll take a few seconds. Okay, so let's begin. As you can tell by reading through the parak, and as I've done here on the Daf Makarot on the source sheet, creating these artificial paragraphs, the parak has a relatively clear structure, and it can be thought of as breaking down into 4 parts. Right? We begin at the beginning of the parak. Parak Kafchet Pasuk Aleph says as follows. והקיל דוד את כל שרי ישראל, שרי השבטים ושרי המחלקות, והמשרתים את המלך, ושרי אלפים, ושרי המאות, ושרי כל רכוש, ומקנה למלך, לבניו עם הסריסים, והגיבורים ולכל גיבור חיל, everybody. Vayakel, David gathers everybody together to where? To Yerushalayim. Right? And this is, of course, the introduction of the parak. Although here, seemingly everybody, every group mentioned in Pasuk Aleph seems to have some sort of tafkid, some sort of function. Later on, as one moves through Kafchet and Kaftet, through the Prakim, it's relatively obvious that everybody is there, that it's Kol Ha'am. If you take a look, for example, very briefly, this is not on the source sheet, right? In Parak Kaftet Pasuk Yud, right? Vayirak David et Hashem le'inei kol ha'kahal. Vayomer David Baruch Ata Hashem Elokei Yisrael. It's Kol HaKahal, and Kol HaKahal is obviously a reference kind of everybody, and the rest of the Am is there as well. So David gathers everybody together, and this is the introduction to the parak. Okay. Now from this point, we move to, on some level, what might already be thought of as the main body or the main idea of the parak. What happens in part 2 of the parak, which begins in Pasuk Bet? Vayakam David HaMelech al Raglav, Vayomer Shima'uni Achai V'Ami Ani Im Levavi. Now you should realize that David stands up, begins to speak, And he speaks until what point, right? He speaks, actually, it's quite a long address. We may think of this as the Ne'um HaGadol, the big speech of David in this parak, and it runs all the way from Pasuk Bet through Pasuk Yud, and it ends in Pasuk Yud, Re'eh ata ki Hashem bachar b'cha livnot bayit HaMikdash chazek va'aseh. Just very briefly, what is the topic of David's Ne'um HaGadol, or David's long speech in Parak Kavchet? Anyone? Anyone? Yeah, so it's the charging, yeah?
Inheritance to Shlomo.
The inheritance to Shelomo. It's the tzava. It's the commanding of Shelomo. And it's the commanding of Shelomo to do what, per se, by the way? Anyone? Yeah, build the Mikdash, right? Okay. And so after part 2, which is David's long address and the command of Shlomo, we move to part 3, which begins in Pasuk Yud Aleph, Vayitin David l'Shlomo beno et tavnit ha'ulam vet batav u'ganazkav v'aliotav. David hands over the detailed plans of the Mikdash, or for the Mikdash, to Shlomo. And this is part 3, more or less, from Pasuk Yud Aleph through Pasuk Yud Tet. And then I think we end the parak in Psukim Kaf and Kaf Aleph in part 4 with just a exhortation, a kind of general exhortation of Shlomo. You take a look at it in Pasuk Kaf. V'yomer David l'Shlomo b'no chazak v'amatz v'aseh al tira v'al techat. Be strong, be fortified, don't be afraid, God will be with you, etc., etc., etc. Everything is going to go great. So we have 4 parts to the parak. Part 1, the introduction. Part 2, the long address, the tzava, the charging of Shlomo. Part 3, the handing over the detailed plans. And finally, part 4, the final exhortation. Now, I think one of the things that's very interesting here is the idea of Hakel here, right? Or it's the Tanakh, the Mikra, goes out of its way to point out that this is a ma'amad of Hakel, right? Take a look at Pasuk Aleph again. Vayikahel David et kol sarei Yisrael. David gathered everybody together, as he pointed out. Or jump down further to Pasuk Chet. V'ata le'nei kol Yisrael kahal Hashem ubaznei Elokeinu shimru. It's again in Pasuk Chet. In the eyes of all Yisrael, Kahal Hashem, the Kahal Hashem. This is a ma'amad of Hakel. And I already read you the pasuk in Parak Kaftet, a bit further on, in Parak Kaftet, if you want to take a look at it for the moment, in Pasuk Yud, Vayvarach David et Hashem le'nei kol HaKahal. Right? So everybody is there. Can anyone think of another example of ma'amad Hakel in Tanakh? Right? I think it's rather interesting that this tzava of Shlomo is done by Ma'amad Hakel. Can anyone think offhand of another example of Hakel? Where else is? Pardon? Moshe, right? There actually are 2 of them in Sefer Dvarim that are worthwhile looking at, right? One is the first time that Hakel is alluded to is actually found, well, right after the Aseret HaDibrot. Take a look in Dvarim, Parak Hey, Pasuk Yud Chet. Happens to be on your Daf Makarot, it's source number 2. Immediately following Aseret HaDibrot, the Torah says, or Moshe says to Am Yisrael in Dvarim, Et HaDvarim ha'ele diber Hashem el kol kahalchem bahar mitoch ha'esh. Right? These words, the Aseret HaDvarim, God spoke to all of your community, all of your kahal, from the mountain mitoch ha'esh, etc. Another mention of Hakel in Sefer Dvarim. This is the easier one, actually. Anyone? Yeah? Back there?
Har Sinai is called Yom HaKahal also.
Yes. Well, this is actually the place. Diber Hashem al kol kahalchem. And a few psukim later, Moshe uses the phrase Yom HaKahal. So, Ma'amad Har Sinai is the classic Yom HaKahal. But of course, what I have in mind is at the very end of Sefer Dvarim, Mitzvat Hakel, in Dvarim, Perek Lamed Aleph, right? Which actually is going to be a very important perek for us today in the shiur. I have it here on the Daf Makorot as well somewhere. If you take a look in Dvarim Perek Lamed Aleph, which I believe is found in source number 9, and you take a look in Dvarim Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Yud, which says as follows, in source number 9. Dvarim Lamed Aleph Yud. Vayitzav Moshe otam lemor miketz sheva shanim b'moed shnat hashmita b'chag HaSukkot. The end of every 7 years, at the time of Chag HaSukkot, Pasuk Yud Aleph, V'vo kol Yisrael l'rot et pnei Hashem Elokecha b'makom asher yivchar tikrat HaTorah azot neged kol Yisrael bazneim. You read out the Torah. Hakel et ha'am v'anashim v'ataf v'gercha asher b'sharecha. Gather together everybody to hear the Torah read. L'man yishmu l'man yimudu v'yirat Hashem Elokechem. So we have kind of classic mentions of Hakel in Sefer Dvarim, right? The Hakel of Moshe. And in general, it seems the gathering of everybody together seems to be associated with what? With Mamad Har Sinai, Limud Torah, right? Yom HaKalchem in Dvarim Perek Hey, or Mitzvah Hakel in Dvarim Perek Lamed Aleph. And I think it's very, very interesting here that in Divrei Yamim Perek Kavchet and Kaftet, the Mikra goes out of its way to point out that this is Ma'amad Hakel, right? And the question, I think, is what is the purpose of David engaging in Ma'amad Hakel? What is he out to accomplish with this Ma'amad Hakel, right? Why do you need everybody all together? What's the point? I certainly understand Hakel for Aseret Dibrot, or I certainly understand Hakel for Mitzvah Hakel, which is perhaps a recreation of the Limud Torah of Mamad Har Sinai, or something along those lines, or some very, very important mitzvah. But it's been unclear why everything here happens by Mamad Hakel, and why Mamad Hakel is necessary, right? Now, of course, the answer is relatively simple. What is it that David wants Mamad Hakel for here in Divrei Yamim, right? What's he out to do in Perek Kavchet? Anyone? Yeah?
Maybe to show that the Mikdash is a continuation of the Mamad Har Sinai experience.
That might be a very interesting idea, but I would adopt a much more minimalistic approach at this point. He wants to do Tzava'at Shlomo. He wants to command Shlomo to build the Beit HaMikdash b'ma'amad hakel. That's what he wants to do, right? So that's the simple answer. Well, why is that necessary is the more interesting question, of course, and we'll come back to that. But at first glance, the purpose of the ma'amad hakel here in Divrei Yamim Perek Kavchet is to be mitzaveh sha'ul ad biniyat Beit HaMikdash in front of everybody, and that's really the structure and the central idea of Perek Kavchet, as we've already seen. Now we get to what I consider the real problem, right? Tzavat Shlomo, did I say Shlomo? Tzavat Shlomo doesn't happen just once in the Tanakh, right? What other book of the Tanakh, obviously, could we say that Tzavat Shlomo happened in? Anyone? Obviously say from Melachim Aleph, right, which is the transition from the world of David to the world of Shlomo. And I think it's very, very interesting. What I'd like to do, now that we realize that Divrei Yamim presents this picture of Tzavat Shlomo b'mamad hakel domel b'mamad har Sinai, what I'd like to do is go back and take a look at Tzavat Shlomo in Sefer Melachim, and it turns out to be slightly different in a very interesting and subtle way. You should remember the psukim. Let's take a look in Melachim Aleph, Perek Melachim Aleph, Perek Bet, right? It's source number 3, okay? So kind of read through it here. So, Melachim Aleph Perek Bet, Pasuk Aleph says as follows. V'yikru yimei David lamut, v'yitzavet Shlomo b'no le'mor. So here is Tzavat Shlomo. Anochi holech baderech kol haaretz. I am going to go in the way of the world. I'm going to die. V'chazakta v'yita le'ish. You'll be strong. You'll be a man. Pasuk Gimel. V'shamarta et mishmeret Hashem elokecha l'lechet b'dirachav l'shmar hachuk k'tav mitzvotav v'mishpotav v'edotav k'katov b'torat Moshe. Keep all the mitzvot. L'man taskil et kol asher ta'aseh v'et kol asher tifnei sham. Everything will be good. So, David brings in Shlomo, he's mitzaveh oto, he commands him, he says, keep the mitzvot, everything will be good, you'll be chazak, you'll man taskil. Go on, let's jump ahead to Pasuk Hey. Pasuk Hey, v'gam ata yadat et asher asa liYoav ben Tzruah, asher asa l'shnei sarei tzvot Yisrael avner ben Ela, Amasa ben Yater v'Yehargem. So then David he talks about, politics with Shlomo. There was Avner and there was Yoav, what they did, and you've got to take care of them, and use your chachma to deal with them. And that's what happens later on in Melachim Aleph. Shlomo uses his chachma to deal with the troublemakers, Yoav, etc., etc., etc. And we go on there, and we're waiting for something when we read Melachim Aleph in light of Divrei Yamim. Once we know Divrei Yamim, let's Tzavav David to Shlomo. So what are we expecting in Sefer Melachim? That Tzava should include Biniyat Beit HaMikdash. But you can look, and you can look, and you can look, and there is no mention of Biniyat Beit HaMikdash in the Tzava of David to Shlomo in Sefer Melachim. And it ends in Pasuk Yud there in that parak, in Melachim Aleph Parak Bet. V'yishkav David im avotav v'yikaver be'ir David. David died, he was buried with his forefathers. No mention whatsoever of the tzava of Bniyat Beit HaMikdash in Sefer Melachim. Now, to make this a bit sharper, fascinatingly enough, there's also no mention of Hakel in Sefer Melachim. But there is a mention of Hakel in Sefer Melachim. Afterwards, later on, after Shelomo deals with the enemies, and after Shlomo's treaties with Hiram, and after the Sidur, the arrangement of all of the building of the materials for the Beit HaMikdash, we eventually get to Perek Zayin, Perek Chet of Sefer Melachim Aleph. And if you take a look in Melachim Aleph, Perek Chet, Pasuk Aleph, it says as follows in source number 4. Az yakel Shlomo et ziknei Yisrael vet kol rashei matot nesei avot v'bnei Yisrael ha'melech Shlomo Yushalayim la'alot et aron brit Hashem me'ir David Hitzion. It's almost as if, in a reverse fashion, the Mikra creates an expectation and disappoints it. Right? Sefer Divrei Yamim later on creates the expectation that David does the hakel to be mitzaveh Shlomo b'bniyat Beit HaMikdash, and then kind of working backwards, so to speak, Sefer Melachim disappoints the expectation created later on by Sefer Divrei Yamim. Because when David commands Shlomo, there's no Ma'amad Hakel and there's no Tzavat Beit HaMikdash. And the only Ma'amad Hakel that you have in Sefer Melachim is done by Shlomo, and it's done after Bniyat Beit HaMikdash, and it's done for the purposes of bringing up the Aron Brit Hashem to Yerushalayim, to the newly built Beit HaMikdash. Now, this is a problem, right? But I'm not going to define this as a problem of contradiction. Okay, there's a tension here between the way the story appears in Sefer Melachim and the way the story appears in Divrei Yamim. We could say, oh, it's a contradiction that Divrei Yamim has Tzavat Shlomo B'niyat Beit HaMikdash B'ma'amad Hakel, and Sefer Melachim thinks that no such thing ever happened, and there's a kind of historical, factual contradiction here, and that would be one way to go. But I don't think so. I don't think there's any explicit contradiction here. It's more that apparently the two Sfarim are interested in presenting different pictures of the events as they occurred. Something along the lines of emphasizing different aspects, right? Sefer Melachim is interested in emphasizing something, I don't know what for the moment, right? Something about the David-Shlomo relationship. And Sefer Divrei Yamim is interested in emphasizing something altogether different. Naniach, it happened. It happened back in Sefer Melachim. But Sefer Divrei Yamim has a particular agenda of emphasizing the Ma'amad Hakel and the Tzavat Shlomo of Bniyat Beit HaMikdash B'Ma'amad Hakel. And that's the first question I would like to deal with in my shiur, which is, what is the interest or the agenda? What exactly is this picture of Ma'amad Hakel that Sefer Divrei Yamim is out to present us and paint for us, where David is mitzaveh Shlomo b'bniyat Beit HaMikdash in this very, very particular way? Why do you need the Ma'amad Hakel, and how does that fit in with the agenda of Sefer Divrei Yamim? That's one question I want to discuss. Any comments? Yeah.
Couldn't we just put it in terms of the larger Divrei Yamim Melachim shift, where things are just in Divrei Yamim there to make I wouldn't say a glorification, but a certain David Shlomo perfect, almost semi-perfect, serene picture of passing and development, and whereas Melachim is highly much more complicated. Why wouldn't we just put it as part of that larger picture?
This is certainly a general possible direction regarding differences between Sefer Melachim and Sefer Divrei Yamim. That Melachim presents us with, let's say, a picture of things, warts and all, we might say, right? In other words, as it is, kamot shehi, right? In other words, I just think, as Beit Shammai says, Ketzim rakna pnei kala, kala kamochi. Tell it as it is, right? And in Sefer Divrei Yamim is Beit Hillel, Ketzim rakna pnei kala, kala na'ava chasuda, right? You don't tell it like it is, you tell it in an idealized fashion. So you could say the difference between Sefer Melachim and Sefer Divrei Yamim is kind of the way it is versus the idealized version, Beit Shammai versus Beit Hillel, so to speak. We pass like Beit Hillel, so that works out good. That's an interesting direction, and I think maybe what I want to suggest is some kind of variation on that, but I like the idea very much. Back here.
So I guess correct me if I'm wrong, but in Divrei Yamim, do we have mention of the fact that it's close to David's death? And that why are we assuming that this is at all the same event that's being portrayed differently? Maybe it's a completely different story.
Okay, well, if you go on in the story of Divrei Yamim, as I entitled The Last Days of David, even though we're discussing Perek Kafchet and Kaftet are somewhat of a unit, And if I remember correctly, if you take a look at the end of Kaftet, right? Take a look at Kaftet Kafchet. At the end of the story, Kaftet Kafchet says, "Vayamat b'seva tova svayamim oshev v'chavod v'imlok Shelomo benot tachtav." Right. So certainly, the latter part of Devarim is a kind of transition narrative where David eventually does die. So I think you have to kind of assume it is the same set of events. Yeah.
Also, to me, Divrei Hayamim in Perek Chafchet, in Pesukim Chat and Chaf they sound like Yehoshua. You know, like the continuity of Moshe to Yehoshua, and here the same kind of an idea, David to Shlomo, the continuity.
Okay, I could not agree with you more. I think that there's a lot of Moshe Yoshua imagery in the David Shlomo story at the end of Divrei Yamim, and I certainly want to head in that direction. I think that's very, very important for resolving some of the problems or issues I'm going to be raising, and I'll come back to that point. So that's a very, very good point. Okay, yeah.
I think the whole purpose of Divrei Hayamim is to extol and to praise David, and anything that is negative is sort of left out. So, it's David is going to continue the Melucha, not Beit Yisrael. It's Beit Yehuda that is going to be the big guy. They're going to be the important guys. So I think that's why there's so much emphasis placed on all the good that David does, and forgets all the negatives. Like, why don't they mention the bad things about David? That's not been mentioned, about the stories about Bathsheba and all those negative stories that wouldn't make David look great.
Okay. What emerges here, and I think the common denominator here, is you can think of Divrei Yamim as the court chronicles, right? They're Divrei Yamim of Melech David, right? They're written by the in-house scribes. So if they're the court chronicles and the in-house scribes, it's not surprising that we get an idealized version which makes Malchut Beit David look wonderful. It's not surprising that we get something that paints them in Moshe-like colors, right? The ultimate leader, right? And this could be a direction to go in terms of the picture that Divrei Yamim is out to present, and the difference between that and Sefer Melachim. I like it, but I want to go in a slightly different direction, or some other different directions. But before I get to that, I want to raise a second question. I mean, the first issue I raised here was the agenda of Sefer Divrei Yamim in painting this Hakel Tzava'a picture of David Shlomo. The second tension I'd like to address between Sefer Melachim and Sefer Divrei Yamim has to do with the remainder of my title. I entitled the shiur for this morning, The Last Days of David. I think that part of the title we've covered. The rest of it is Mikdash David and Mikdash Shelomo. Now, what on earth could I possibly mean by that? Well, Mikdash Shelomo, we all know what that is. That's the Beit HaMikdash that was built by Shlomo Melech, and the Sefer Melachim actually refers to Mikdash Shelomo even on some plane. However, I think if we pay careful attention to the picture presented here in our parak, in Parak Kafchet, something very, very interesting emerges. And let me explain what I mean. Let's take a look in David's main address, in other words, somewhat the main body of our parak. Let's pick it up for the moment in Parak Kafchet, Pasuk Bet. It says as follows: Vayakam David HaMelech al raglav, vayomer shma'uni achai v'ami ani im levavi livnot beit menucha laron brit Hashem ladam raglei Elokeinu v'achinoti livnot. I wanted to build the Beit HaMikdash, v'achinoti livnot, and I began the preparations to build the Beit HaMikdash. Now, in fact, Sefer Divrei Yamim talks extensively about David's preparations to build the Beit HaMikdash. You can even argue that everything from Parak Kaf Bet through the end of the Sefer, from Parak Kaf Bet and on, as you remember, you've learned it recently, through the end of the Sefer, is about David's hachanot, his preparations for building the Beit HaMikdash. Whether this is the social organization, whether this is the giyus, the induction of the people for the project, whether this is the actual physical preparation of the materials. And it's very important to note some psukim back in Parak Kaf Bet of Divrei Yamim Aleph. Take a look on your sheet in Divrei Yamim Aleph, Parak Kaf Bet, Pasuk Yud Dalid. We have another reference to the preparations of David. Source number 5 says as follows: Kaf Bet Yud Dalid. V'nei ba'ani hachinoti leveit Hashem zahav kikarim me'a elef v'kesef elef alafim kikarim v'lanachoshev larazel ein mishkal. No, wait, it can't even be measured. Ki l'rov hayat, so much I prepared. V'eitzim v'avanim hachinoti v'aleim tosif. There's gold and there's silver and there's nachoshev and there's eitzim and there's avanim, and I prepared it and I prepared it and I prepared it. Add some more, but I prepared it. And then more than that, pasuk Tedvav v'imcha l'rov osei melacha chotzvim v'choshei even ve'etz v'chol chacham b'chol malacha, and you have the manpower to do the job as well, Shlomo, and etc. And then in Pasuk Yud Zayin, in source number 5, vayitzav David l'chol Sarei Yisrael lazor l'Shlomo uveno. So 1, there's the desire of David to build the Mikdash. 2, there are the preparations of the materials, the manpower, everything that's needed to build the Beit HaMikdash. We go on back to Parak Kafchet for the moment. And in Parak Kafchet, if we go on a bit further, what's part 3 of Parak Kafchet? Let's pick it up in Parak Kafchet, Pasuk Yud Aleph, in source number 1 again. Vayitein David l'Shlomo v'no et tavnit ha'olam ואת בתיו וגזניקיו ועליותיו וחדריו הפנימית ובית הכפורת, פסוק י"ב, ותבנית כל... What is it, tavnit, by the way? Anyone? Blueprints. He gave him blueprints. It's not just that he gives him, talks about his desire. It's not just that he gives him materials and manpower. He gives him the blueprints. Here they are. And this is exactly what you're supposed to do, right? And the word tavnit appears 4 times in part 3 of the parak. You could see it in Yud Aleph and Yud Bet, tavnit, and then again at the end in Yud Chet Yud Tet, tavnit. It's a quasi-frame or structure kind of thing where the giving of the detailed plans to Shelomo, which is part 3 of the parak, is bracketed by the word tavnit twice at the beginning, twice at the end, in what we might call an AA structure. Not really a structure, but it's kind of obvious what's going on here. And it's not just that. Where did David HaMelech get the plans from? So he's rather explicit about where he got the plans from. Take a look again at the beginning there in Pasuk Yud Bet. V'tavnit kol asher haya baruach imo, and the blueprints of everything that was in the spirit with me. Or jump down to Pasuk Yud Tet. Hakol bichtav miyad Hashem. Everything is written down from Hashem. Alai hiskil. It was given to me intelligently, or I understood it. Kol melachot tavnit, all of the work of the blueprints. Now there's a machloket parshanim as to what this means that David had the blueprints to build the Mikdash beruach me'et Hashem, or alai hiskil me'et Hashem. Right? One possibility is that the Midrash has this picture of Shmuel and David huddled somewhere working together on the blueprints, where Shmuel HaNavi, or perhaps God HaNavi, told David what would be the blueprints of the Mikdash. But I think it's more likely, in terms of Pshuta Shel Mikra, and some Parshanim assume this position, that no, David claims prophetic inspiration for the blueprints of the Beit HaMikdash, and he gives the plans over to Shlomo. Now, if we put this all together, I think we have a strong sense that we could talk about the Mikdash as Mikdash David. It is his project, his initiation, his desire, his plans, his divine inspiration, and his materials that he's handing over to Shlomo as part of the tzava. And if you had to ask yourself, what's the picture based upon Divrei, you would say this is Mikdash David. Now, the problem, of course, is that when you go back to Sefer Melachim, this is all completely and absolutely missing. None of this is there whatsoever, and this is a completely different picture that's presented. Take a look in source number, 6, which is Melachim Aleph Perek Hey, which is after David has died, and the Mikra, Sefer Melachim, begins to discuss the relationship between Shlomo and Hiram. Okay? And Melachim Aleph Perek Hey, Pasuk Tet Zayin says as follows. Veishlach Shlomo el Hiram limor, Pasuk Yud Zayin, Atay yadat et David avi ki lo yochol livnot bayit l'shem Hashem Elokav. He could not build the bayit, b'pnei milchama, etc., etc. And now we're going to build the bayit. Take a look in Pasuk Yud Tet. V'hineni omer livnot bayit l'shem Hashem Elokai, kasher diber Hashem el David avi limor bincha asher ata atein tachtecha al kisecha hu yivnei habayit l'shmi. I'm going to do it, right? And now Pasuk Kaf. V'ata tzaveh v'yichrutu li arazim min ha'levanon. ועבדי יהיו עם עבדיך ושכר עבדיך אתן לך כל אשר תאמר כי אתה ידעת כי אין בנו איש יודע לכרות עצים כצידונים. Shlomo sends to Hiram and says 2 things. A, I'm going to build a Mikdash, as I'm supposed to, true. B, send me the eitzim because I don't have any eitzim because I need those eitzim from Lebanon because I need the workers of you, Hiram, the king of Lebanon, because how else am I possibly ever going to build the Beit HaMikdash? And if you jump down to Pasuk Lamed Aleph and Lamed Bet, Vayitzav HaMelech Vayisu Avanim Gedolot, Avanim Yikrot, Yasei Rabayit Avnei Gazit, Lamed Bet, Vayifselu B'nei Shelomo, B'nei Hiram, Vayagvilim, Vayachinu Eitzim, Vavanim Levanot HaBayit. So all the Eitzim and the Avanim come from Lebanon, from Hiram, and this is all Shlomo's project, and he has the tax, and they're his workers, and he's got thousands of workers, and it's a completely different picture. As opposed to it being David's project, David's desire, David's plans, and David's materials, this seems to be Shlomo's project, right? Shlomo's materials, right, gotten from Hiram, and Shlomo's project. And I think there's even one kind of almost strange, smoking, shocking pasuk. Take a look at source number 7, which is Malachim Aleph, Perek Zayin, Pasuk Nen Aleph. Vatishlam kol malacha asher asa melech Shlomo. Beit Hashem. All the work that Shlomo did for Beit Hashem was done. V'yavei Shlomo et kadshei David aviv et hakesef et hazahav et hakilem natan ba'otzrot Beit Hashem. All the materials that David had gathered, what did he do with them? He stored them. They weren't actually used to build the bayit, or apparently not even actually used to build the bayit, according to Sefer Melachim. And again, I'm not so sure there's a contradiction problem here. But again, I'll talk about a tension problem in terms of the picture that's presented by the different Sfarim. In Sefer Melachim, the Biniyat Beit HaMikdash is presented as Melechet Shlomo, as Mikdash Shlomo, his treaty with Hiram, the gathering of the material, the organizing of the workers, the nihul of the entire project. But Sefer Divrei Yamim presents a completely different picture of Mikdash David, which is the desire of David, the plans of David, the inspiration of David, the materials of David, etc., etc., etc. And again, my question is, what's the agenda of Sefer Divrei Yamim? What's the picture that's being created here? What's the point of emphasizing the Mikdash David aspect of things here in Sefer Divrei Yamim? So, those are, I guess that's the first part of the shiur. The two central issues I want to raise here are problems. One, the purpose of the Ma'amad Hakel for the Tzava'ah in our parak, and two, the emphasis on the Mikdash David aspect of things here. Okay. Take any comments, if there are any comments or questions at this point. Yes?
The Hiram thing is mentioned in Ibrahim Bet. In other words, that discussion, that back and forth, that how to bring the Eitzim, would that be, I mean, Ibrahim does mention it by Shlomo.
I agree. It certainly is mentioned there later on in Divrei Yamim Bet in the context of Shlomo. And that's, again, why I don't think there's any real contradiction here. But I still think that there's something very interesting here at the end of Divrei Yamim Aleph. This story of the last days of David is out to emphasize certain things that, when we think about the larger context, are a little bit surprising. The Ma'amad Hakel is being so central, the role of David is being so central, and those are kinds of the things that jump out at me from the parak here. Okay, any other comments? Yes?
I don't know what the answer to the question is that was posed, but it seems very similar to the way Dvarim clarifies or changes many of the stories we hear in Shemos and Bamidbar, and there's a reason for that always. I don't know what the reason for it is here, but it seems like a parallel kind of a thing.
Okay, it seems like a good point. Okay. I'd like to share, yeah.
What does he mean when he tells Hiram, "I'll tell you that David Aviti lo yachol libnos"? Why Hiram? Why should he have that knowledge?
I don't know. That's a good question, right? Apparently, Hiram was an old family ally that he's not really mentioned before the beginning of Melachim Aleph, right? But apparently, he's an old family political ally, and it was apparently known that there was some sort of issue with David building the Beit HaMikdash. It's a good point. Perhaps we'll come back to it a little bit later. Okay. That's just a few different, perhaps two theories as to how to resolve some of the questions I raised. The first, which I think might be based upon a comment of Radak, it might be somewhat rooted in the approach of Chazal to Perek Kafchet. And to get to this, let's visit the point that was just made, the issue of David not building the Beit HaMikdash. Right? At the end of the day, David doesn't build the Beit HaMikdash. Why can't David build the Beit HaMikdash? Well, interestingly enough, if you think about it, Perek Kavchet of Sefer Divrei Yamim presents a very particular theory, a very particular explanation as to why David cannot build the Beit HaMikdash. Take a look in Perek Kavchet, Pasuk Bet. Let's pick it up there at the beginning of part 2. Okay? Vayakam David HaMelech al Raglav, in the big address, or the long speech of David to the Am. Vayakam David HaMelech al Raglav, Vayomer Shemauni Achai V'ami. Hear my brothers, my people. Ani imlu avi livnot beit menucha la'aron brit Hashem v'ladom raglai Elokeinu v'achinoti livnot. I wanted to do it. I began to prepare. Pasuk Gimel. Ve'elokim amar li, and God said to me, Lo tivneh vayit l'shmi. You will not build the house to my name. Ki ish milchamot ata v'damim shafachta. Because you're a man of war and you spilled a lot of blood. And then God goes on to address David and explain to him, well, therefore it's going to be Shelomo, right? And we take a look in Pasuk Yud, right? Hashem bachar b'chal livnot bayit hamikdash chazek v'aseh. What does this mean in Pasuk Gimel that he can't build a house because he's a man of war and he spilled a lot of blood? What is that? Yeah, anyone? He put Uriah Hitti in the front lines. That's true. So what? I mean, Shlomo also, he doesn't spill blood. I mean, think about it, right? In other words, wasn't he even commanded by David earlier on to take care of Yoav ben Tzruya, in the case of Avner, back in the Tzava and Sefer Melachim? People, the wars happen, people spill blood. What's...
David is telling him to take care. David is telling him what he should do. He's giving the charge to Shlomo. Basically, David was involved in wars. He was on the run. He was like, he's not in East Shalom when all is said and done. And I don't think Hashem wanted the Beit HaMikdash to be built by a man, but David feels terrible about the whole situation.
Okay, look, this is the classic interpretation of Pasuk Gimel, and this is the understanding of Chazal, and this is Radak's comment here, both here in Perek Kavchet and Perek Kavbet. I'd like to see it inside, which gives a very, very nice and complicated formulation of the general theme of David as an Ish Milchamar and Ish Damim. Take a look in, I have a comment here on the Makorot sheet. Take a look in source number 8, which is the Radak, here in Divrei Yamim Aleph, but it's back in Perek Kavbet, as opposed to here in Perek Kavchet, back in Kavbet Chet. And it says as follows, Dam l'rov shafachta. V'zeh, here's a key point Radak begins with, Ze lo matzanu sha'amar lo Hashem. We actually never found that God said this to David, right? God just told David through the Nevu'ah of Natan HaNavi back in Shmuel Bet Perek Zion, when David wanted to first build the Mikdash. You can't do it. He didn't explain why, right? So Radak says this explanation of Ish Milchama and Ish Damim was not said by God. Aval David Amar Kain B'libo. This was David's interpretation. Ki mipnei zem mana'o Hashem livnot habayit. It was because of this that God told him not to, or didn't allow him to build the bayit. Oh, Natan HaNavi Amar Lo. Okay, now maybe Natan had told him on the side, so to speak. There are many cases like this. So, first of all, where does this information come from that David is an Ish Damim or an Ish Milchama? Well, either that's David's parshanut, his interpretation, his personal interpretation of the prohibition that God put upon him through Natan HaNavi, or maybe Natan HaNavi told him as a kind of sidebar at some point, and that's the first point Radak makes. Then, Radak moves on to explain exactly what the idea is. Take a look at the next little paragraph. U'ba'amro, damim larov shafachta arza, ki dam nikiyim haya b'damim asher shafach. There was dam naki, clean blood, innocent blood. David spilled innocent blood. Kamo dam Uriah, as mentioned earlier, he put Uriah Hitti, and that was clearly a chet. He killed Uriah Hitti. B'zeh lifnei. Gam b'dmei hakohanim haya hu hasiba kamosh amar hasiboti b'chol nefesh beit avicha. This is another great example, perhaps, of David spilling innocent blood. What Radak refers to here is a story back in Shmuel Aleph, Perek Kaf, I believe. It's not on your Daf Makorot, but if you have a Tanakh, you could take a look very briefly. When Shaul, in part of his chase of David, eventually comes to the city of Nov and eradicates the entire city of Nov, which David had recently visited. In Parak Kaf Bet of Sefer Shmuel Aleph, there's a refugee from the city of Nov, Evyatar. Evyatar comes to David, and we read there in Parak Kaf Gimel. Parak Kaf Gimel Pasuk Kaf Bet, Parak Kaf Bet Pasuk Kaf Bet. David says to Evyatar, "V'yomer David Evyatar yadati bayom ahu." Pardon me. I knew that Doeg was there, and then Yadati bayom ahu ki sham Doeg hadomei ki yaged l'Shaul anochi saboti b'chol nefesh beit avicha. What David says, he takes responsibility for the wiping out of the entire city of Nov by Shelomo, right? By Shaul. Because of his negligence in terms of not paying attention to the fact that Doeg was there, therefore he caused it. So David takes responsibility, right? So in other words, what Radak says is that the reason why David is prohibited from building the Beit HaMikdash is in Ishdam, he spilled innocent blood, whether it's the innocent blood of Uriah Hittite, or it's the innocent blood of the Kohenei Nov in a kind of indirect way. Now, going back to Radak's comment, he now brings it home a bit further, and in the middle of source number 8, and he continues on and says as follows. There were also non-Jews that he fought against, he spilled their blood. And even so, there were other innocent people in the wars of David. And furthermore, then Radak brings it all together and explains the idea in the second little artificial paragraph in source number 8. Aval, kivan shenizdamen lo shfichut damim l'rov, manu milivnot Beit HaMikdash. He was prevented from building the Beit HaMikdash. Shu l'shalom u'lechaparat avon u'le'ateret tefillah. We now get to the philosophical point. Why is there a contradiction between David is an Ish Milchamar and Ish Dam, the innocent blood that David has spilled, and the building of the Beit HaMikdash? So Radak says, following Chazal, is that the purpose of the Beit HaMikdash is shalom, peace, kaparat avon, ula-atar tefillah, forgiveness of sin, and for the raising up of tefillah. And it would seem these are kind of opposite categories, or these are theologically or philosophically opposite categories. Dam naki, innocent blood, death, on the one hand, and shalom, tefillah, and forgiveness on the other hand. Philosophically, these are opposite categories. And that's why David was prevented from building the Beit HaMikdash. And finally, Radak brings one further proof from Divrei Chazal. Kimo shemanu lehinif barzel b'mizbeach u'beit HaMikdash lefi sha'barzel osim mimenu kli hariga lo yasem mimenu kli shalom barov. What is Radak referring to here? He's referring to Midrash on Shmot Perek Kaf. Take a look in Shmot Perek Kaf, immediately after the Aseret HaDibrot. In Shmot Perek Kaf, Pasuk Kaf Bet, we read as follows. V'mizbach avanim ta'aseli, if you build a mizbeach of stones, lo tivnei aten gazit, do not make it hewn, ki charbacha hinafta alev v'techaleleha. You can't make the mizbeach out of hewn stones. Why not? Chazal or Doresh, and Radak quotes it here, because that involves metal. Kli barzel, which is a kli milchama. And kli milchama and dam are the opposite of mizbeach and kapara and shalom and mikdash. And this is why David cannot build the Beit HaMikdash. Now, here's what I'd like to suggest. I think, why can't David build the Beit HaMikdash? The truth is, he wants to. And on some level, it is Mikdash David, but God prevents him. And why does God prevent him? God prevents him because of this great philosophical and ethical truth of the fact that there's a kind of inherent contradiction between blood and innocent blood and dam and milchama on the other hand, and the idea of Beit HaMikdash and Avodat Hashem and kapara and Atarat Tefillah. And that's the reason why God stops David and why he can't build the Mikdash. I would like to suggest this explains the picture of Mikdash David, because on some level in Sefer Divrei Yamim, it really is Mikdash David, and he wants to build the Mikdash. But it also explains the Hakel, I think, right? What is Hakel about in general? Well, go back to Dvarim Perek Lamed Aleph. Take a look in source number 9. Take a look at Mitzvah Hakel in Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Yud Bet. Hakel ta'am hanashim v'anashim v'ataf v'gercha sheb'sharecha. Gather everybody together. L'man yishma'u, l'man yumudu, v'yiru et Hashem Elokeichem v'shamru la'asot et kol divrei haTorah hazot. Pasuk Yud Gimel. U'v'neihem asher le'yodu yishma'un v'lamdu liyiru et Hashem Elokeichem kol ha'yamim asher atem chayim al adama Hashem ha'ovrim et ha'yarden Hashem l'rishta. What Hakel is about in Sefer Dvarim, it's about teaching Torah. It's about teaching the Aseret HaDibrot, teaching ethical truths, teaching philosophical truths. I would like to suggest that the Hakel of David at the end of Sefer Divrei Yamim is exactly the same kind of thing. David is makil ta'am not just to be mitzaveh et Shaul, but he's makil ta'am to teach Torah, to teach something like the Aseret HaDibrot. And what is it that he's out to teach? He's out to teach the great ethical and philosophical and theological truth that there's a contradiction between dam naki, milchama on the one hand, and B'niyat Beit HaMikdash, Teret Tefillah, and Kapara on the other hand. Meaning, the purpose of Hakel is for David to share with Shelomo and all of Am Yisrael the Torah, which is that this principle exists, and that's why he can't build the Beit HaMikdash. And I think that would be an explanation based upon Radak for our first question, is why the Mamad Hakel? Because it's Mamad Hakel teaching Torah, just like Moshe and Sefer Devarim. But the Torah here is the philosophical truth of the contradiction between Dam Naki on the one hand and B'niyat Beit HaMikdash on the other hand, and that's much of what the focus is here in the parak. Now, if you take this approach, I think we can also kind of use it to think about some of the differences we've talked about between Sefer Melachim on the one hand and Sefer Divrei Yamim on the other hand. And why is the Mamad Hakel and the teaching found in Sefer Divrei Yamim as opposed to in Sefer Melachim? And what was suggested earlier about the differences between Sefer Melachim on the one hand and Sefer Divrei Yamim on the other hand is that, well, Melachim is the warts and all, right? And Sefer Divrei Yamim is the idealized version, maybe because it's kind of the court chronicles. Now, I agree that's one way to think about Sefer Melachim versus Sefer Divrei Yamim, but I actually tend to think of it a little bit differently. You could think of Sefer Melachim, for lack of a better term, as, I don't know if history is the right term. I don't know if a personal sefer is the right term. Maybe it's narrative, right? It's a story, right? It's about the lives of David and Shelomo, the politics, the difficulties, the rise, the fall, the warts and all, so to speak. It's classical biblical narrative, right? It's sipur, which is really about Chayim Lifnei Hashem, right? How do individuals and the Am live in the eye of God, right? That might be in the shadow of God's providence, right? What's the story of the individual and the nation living out their lives in history tachat hashkachat Hashem, right? That might be a nice way to think about biblical narrative or sipur, thinking of Sefer Bereshit or Shmot or Vayikra, Bamidbar, right? Yeshua, Shmuel, Shoftim, and the like. Now, there are some books in the Tanakh that don't really conform to that kind of thing, that kind of definition of biblical narrative. They're not story of the individual or the nation living in history in the eye of God, right? And with all the kind of personal and political aspects. They're, for lack of a better term, might be thought as almost theological literature, exhortation. Sometimes there are mitzvot, right? Sometimes there's theology, there are philosophical principles. Sometimes there's teachings, there's Torah. Sometimes there's inspiration, right? These might be thought of as national sfarim. They're books that are given to the Am, and they're meant as exhortation, as inspiration, as theology. Sometimes this is called ideological literature. It's not narrative, but it's ideology. I think the classic example of the kind of book that's teaching, right, or that's ideology, that's theology, that's a national book as opposed to a personal book, right? Sefer Dvarim, right? The last speech of Moshe, where he's out to strengthen the people and to exhort them and to teach them Torot, to learn how to live. That's what Sefer Dvarim is about. I would like to suggest, it seems to me, that perhaps Sefer Divrei Yamim is exactly like Sefer Dvarim. Sefer Divrei Hayamim it's not a Mishnah Torah in the sense that Sefer Dvarim is, but it is a kind of Mishnah Torah. It's a Mishnah Torah of the history of Am Yisrael, but that's meant to teach theology, it's meant to teach ideology, it's meant to strengthen, it's meant to exhort, etc. And then it turns out that, wow, in the end of the day, that's why Sefer Shoftim and Sefer Melachim and Sefer Divrei Hayamim present very, very different pictures of the tzava of Shelomo by David. In Sefer Melachim, you have the personal and the political, the narrative, what David says to Shelomo, how to deal with the court enemies, etc., etc., etc. And the whole tzava of Bniyat Beit HaMikdash and the emphasis of the great philosophical and moral truth of the opposition between Dam Naki and Bniyat Beit HaMikdash, that's not relevant to the whole world of narrative of Sefer Melachim, and it's not there. But then we come to Sefer Divrei Hayamim, which is about teaching. It's a kind of Mishnah Torah. Then you have Mamad Hakel like Sefer Dvarim, and you have the teaching of the great truth like Sefer Dvarim, because it's all about inspiring and exhorting and teaching the people what they need to know to move forward in a Moshe-like fashion, and that explains the different picture that you find here in Divrei Hayamim. So that's one approach I would like to take. If I could sum it up, it's all about the teaching of the Torah, of the contradiction between Dam Naki and Beit HaMikdash. The Mamad Hakel is about that. And that fits in with the different agendas of the books of Sefer Melachim and the book of Divrei Hayamim. Okay. I have approximately 10 minutes left because they told me this year was an hour long and I started at 11:23. So I would like to suggest another possibility or a complementary approach as to how to deal with some of the questions I raised. And I'd like to go back to some of the very sharp comments that were made earlier in the shiur about Moshe and Yehoshua imagery in the parak, and I'd like to go back to the text of Parak Kavchet and pursue a different approach, and then wrap things up a little bit in the time we have remaining. So take a look in Parak Kavchet again, towards the end, the latter part of part 2, and suddenly in the latter part of part 2, this whole language begins to creep in here, which should set up certain kinds of echoes for us. Take a look in Parak Kavchet, Pasuk Zayin for the moment. Parak Kavchet Pasuk Zayin in source number 1 says as follows: V'achinoti et malchuto ad olam im yechazak la'asot mitzvotai mishpatai kayom hazeh. Pasuk Chet V'atal enei kol Yisrael kal Hashem v'vaznei Elokei shimru v'dishu kol mitzvot Elokechem l'man tishu et ha'aretz hatova v'itnachaltem livnechem acharechem ad olam. This is actually quite strange and bizarre. David is talking to Shelomo about Bniyat Beit HaMikdash. And suddenly, almost he digresses, and he stops talking about Bniyat Beit HaMikdash, and he starts talking about, be chazak in the mitzvot, and if you're chazak in the mitzvot, you'll be yoresh the aretz, v'itnachaltem, livnechem, acharechem, aro. What does that mean? Isn't kibush haaretz already finished, right? This is, Malchut David has been set up. Why suddenly? It's like he's taking us back to somewhere else where there was an issue of being chazak b'mitzvot, so you could be yoresh the aretz. That's already happened. Why is it strange why David is talking this language? And the obvious answer is, well, it's echoing something, right? Let's go on a bit further. There's much more of it. Jump down to the fourth part of the parak, which we began with, Pasuk Kaf, which is the final exhortation to Shelomo there. Pasuk Kaf says, "V'yom edaber l'Shlomo b'no chazek v'amatz, be strong and be fortified, v'aseh and do, al teira v'al techat, don't be afraid, don't be discouraged. Ki Hashem Elokim Elokei imach, God is with you. Lo yarpecha v'lo yazvecha, He won't abandon you, He won't leave you." Now, if you think, let's add this together. 1, chazak v'amatz. 2, mitzvot. 3, Yerushat Haaretz, right? 4, Al Tirava Al Techas. 5, God is with you, Hashem Imcha. 6, Lo Yarpecha V'lo Yazveka. Every single one of these languages is an echo of things you remember earlier on from the world of Moshe and Yehoshua. And guess which parak in Dvarim is the first parak to introduce these languages? Guess which one? It's really actually quite wonderful. It's Dvarim Perek Lamed Aleph, the same one which teaches Mitzvat Hakel. And what I'm going to try to show you is that on some level, our entire parak is a reconstruction or a rebuild in different ways of Dvarim Perek Lamed Aleph. Let's go back to Dvarim Perek Lamed Aleph. Take a look in source number 9, I believe it was. You have there in Perek Lamed Aleph, source number 9. Let's pick it up for the moment in Pasuk Zayin. Okay, Pasuk Zayin says, "Vayikra Moshe leYeshua vayomer elav la'inei kol Yisrael chazek va'amatz ki ata tavo et ha'am hazeh el haaretz asher nishba Hashem lavotam latet lahem v'ata tanchila otam." 1, chazak va'amatz. 2, Yushat Haaretz. 3, Tanchila, Pasuk Chet. V'Hashem hu olech lefanecha hu yeh imcha v'lo yapercha v'lo yasvecha lo tirav lo techat. And here's the 4 and the 5. In other words, this is, David is using Moshe-like language that Moshe used to charge Yehoshua. He is using that same language to charge Shlomo. And you have the Chazek v'Amatz, you have the Mitzvot, you have the Aretz, you have the Yusha, you have the Shem Imcha, lo yapercha, lo yasvecha, lo tirav lo techas. God uses the same language again in Sefer Yehoshua. Take a look in source number 10, Yehoshua Perek Aleph, Pasuk Hey. I'll be with you, I will not abandon you, I will not leave you alone. Pasuk Vav, Chazek v'amatz, ki ata tanchil haaretz. Jump down to Pasuk Tet. Lo tziviticha chazek v'amatz, al tarotz v'al techat, ki Hashem imcha Hashem elokecha. What is the point of this, of the mitzvot, the Rushat Da'aret, the Tanchilena, Chazek V'amatz, Lo Tira, Lo Tichat, God with you? What's the point of the parallel? I think it's clear that the point of the parallel is that both stories are, well, what are they? They're both transition narratives, right? In other words, in the transition narrative of Sefer Dvarim and Sefer Yehoshua, of Moshe to Yehoshua, he talks about being chazak, the land, the mitzvot, God being with you, etc. And so too here, we have a transition narrative between David and Shlomo, which involves the exact same kind of languages, right? And the point of the parallel is to make the point that these are similar transitions, identical transitions, and that's one parallel, the languages, right? With the second, that it's a transition narrative. Third parallel. In both stories, when you think about it, what does the Av, or the Abba, want to do? What does the Abba want to do? He has some mission he wants to complete. That's very, very important to him, right? But for some mysterious reason, by divine fiat, he's prevented from performing that mission that he wants to perform, and it's going to have to be left to the next generation to perform that mission, right? We already know that. That's the central motif of Perek Kafchet of Sefer Divrei Yamim. This is Mikdash David. David wants to do it, but God has prevented him from divine fiat for some mysterious reason that really it's even difficult to figure out, right? But God prevented the dying leader from fulfilling his last mission, and the dying leader must now pass on that last mission to his disciple, to his son, as the case may be. Take a look in Dvarim Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Aleph for the moment, right? Dvarim Perek Lamed Aleph, in source number 9, says as follows. וילך משה וידבר את הדברים האלו אל כל ישראל ויאמר עליהם בן 120 שנה אנוכי היום לא אוכל עוד לצאת ולבוא Vashem amar Eli lo tavar et yarden hazeh. Of course I want to do it. V'achinoti livnot. I want to do it, but God won't let me do it, right? So one parallel is the languages, second parallel is the general transition, and the third parallel is the dying leader who cannot fulfill the last mission and must carry it on to the next generation. The fourth parallel, Dvarim Perek Lamed Aleph and Divrei Yamim Aleph Kafchet, both have mitzvot hakel, and then they both have hakel, right? That's obvious, right? If you think about it, wait a second. If Shlomo is Yehoshua and Moshe is David, or David is Moshe, right? Then there's another echo of the hakel here, because Moshe doesn't just perform hakel at Mamad Har Sinai. There's a first time that Moshe performs hakel, and it's actually last week's parsha. Take a look in Shmot, Perek Lamed Hey, Pasuk Aleph, which is here on your sheet. Source number 11 says, Vayakel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael v'yomer alehem ele hadvarim asher tziva Hashem lasot otam k'chu me'echem truma l'Hashem skipping over the Pesukim of Shabbat k'chu me'echem truma l'Hashem kol nediv libo yevena trumat Hashem zavak. Moshe gathers all of Am Yisrael the first time, the first hakel of Moshe. For what purpose? to build the Mishkan. So if David is Moshe in the parallel of Divrei Aleph Kafchet, he's makil not just to charge Shelomo, but also it's hakel to get everybody engaged in building the Mikdash. And if you think about Divrei Yamim Kafchet Kaftet, in the end of the day, what do the people do? They're mitnadev, incredible amounts of materials for the building of the Mikdash / Mishkan. So again, we've now we're beginning to get further along here. And one last point. Take a look in Shmot, Perek Kaf He, Pasuk Chet, a psukim that also should be familiar to us, source number 12. God says to Moshe, Vasul de Mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, Pasuk Tet, K'chol asher ani mareh otcha, et tavnit hamishkan, ve'et tavnit kol kela v'chein ta'asu. Moshe was inspired through Nevuah from HaKadosh Baruch Hu with the Tavniot, with the blueprints of the Mishkan. And likewise in Divrei Yamim Kafchet, David, who is in the role of Moshe, is inspired by HaKadosh Baruch Hu with the Tavniot, with the blueprints of the Mishkan. So we have many, many parallels here between Moshe and Yeshua on the one hand, and David and Shlomo on the other hand. We have the dying leader passing on the baton. We have all the languages of Chazek v'Amatz, Yushat Ta'aretz, Mitzvot, and the like. We have the dying leader prevented from fulfilling his mission because of divine fiat. We have the double hakel of Moshe in Sefer Dvarim and in Sefer Shmot, which David is doing both simultaneously here in Divrei Yamim. And of course we have the father figure being divinely inspired to build the Mishkan / Mikdash, Moshe and David respectively, etc. So we've resolved a lot of our problems now, right? By noting this literary parallel, we've actually made our first two questions go away, right? We don't need to wonder anymore as to why it is that there's hakel here. Well, of course there's hakel here, because this is David's Moshe Rabbeinu-like moment, and the double hakel has to happen. And we don't need to really wonder why this is Mikdash David anymore in Sefer Divrei Yamim, because David is Moshe Rabbeinu, so the same as it's Mishkan Moshe and the Tavniot and the Tochniot of Moshe, so too it's Mishkan, it's Mikdash David here in Divrei Yamim. So the parallel explains everything, but even though the parallel explains everything, we actually still, in fact, understand nothing. And let me explain what I mean. We don't understand the meaning of the parallel. What's the point of the parallel? It's difficult. It seems to me, and maybe this was suggested earlier, that maybe the idea is as follows, that not every leader can do everything. And maybe that each generation, on some level, requires its own national mission. And the way this works is that each leader gets one mission that he accomplishes, and then a mission that he can't accomplish and has to leave for the next generation. In the case of Moshe, what's his mission? His mission is Geula miMitzrayim and the Tinat Torah, right? Think of that. Geula in both its physical and spiritual senses. That's the mission of Moshe. But the end of that process, Knisa La'aretz, that's something that Moshe doesn't get to do. And the transition from Moshe to Yeshua is setting up that next stage of national life, of the national mission, and the tzava of Yeshua, the chazak v'amatz, and the mitzvot, and atatam tkanet arts. It's all about creating that national mission for the which is passed on to the new generation of Yehoshua. Okay, now, it seems to me that that's exactly the same as the David-Shlomo relationship. At the end of the day, David, what's his role? His role is, effectively, the completion of Yeshua's mission. Kibush Haaretz is in fact never really complete throughout Sefer Yeshua, Sefer Shoftim, Sefer Shemot, throughout the entire Tkufa, even through the time of Shaul. Only B'yamei David can we say that mission 2, Kibush Haaretz, is finished, and that's what David is about. He builds the Melucha, which is the concretization of Kibush Haaretz. But what's the next mission? There's one more national mission after Geula and Kibush Haaretz, and that's B'niyat Beit HaMikdash, B'niyat Beit Menucha Hashem, Hashrat HaShechina in the nation, and everything else that Beit HaMikdash represents. And that person too, David, in the Moshe role, doesn't get to do that next mission. That third mission is left for the next generation, for the next role. That mission that David can't accomplish with Beit HaMikdash, that's given over to Shelomo, to the next generation. That becomes the new national mission of the next generation. And I think that could be the meaning here of the parallel between David and Shelomo on the one hand, and Moshe and Yeshua on the other hand. And to pull this all together, I would like to suggest, I kind of suggested a second theory here to explain all of our problems. How to deal with the Ma'amad Hakel, how to deal with the notion of Mikdash David. This can all be explained or worked through because of the David Shlomo versus Moshe Yeshua parallel, where David parallels Moshe. And the fundamental idea here seems to be that each leader gets his national mission, and then he gets something else that's undone, that he passes on to the next generation in a kind of strong way, and that new generation does that new national mission. The same as Yeshua inherits Kibush Haaretz from Moshe, so too Shlomo inherits Binyan Beit HaMikdash from David HaMelech. And again, this is part of the agenda of Sefer Divrei Yamim, right? In Melachim, we're concerned with the personal, the political, the life of Bnei Hashem, and in Divrei Yamim, we're concerned with the national, and hence it comes along and defines this national mission as appropriate for this generation. Okay, I would wrap up with just one last, perhaps, comment. I talked here about Binyan Beit HaMikdash, primarily about Sefer Divrei Yamim versus Sefer Melachim. But just to kind of add one point, perhaps we've learned two crucial things about Bniyat Beit HaMikdash in our shiur. One, that Bniyat Beit HaMikdash cannot be mitoch milchama, cannot be mitoch dam naki, since it comes for shalom and kapara and tefillah, as Radak taught us in Chazal, it has to come from moral and ethical perfection, and that's very important to think about. And also, that the hashgacha elyona, that divine providence decrees there's the right time and the right place for everything. When Aretz is conquered and Melucha is established and the generation receives its mission, this is the time for Beit HaMikdash, and B'mhei Rabbi Amenu.